I never expected to want to be a teacher. As I mentioned, my mom was a librarian. Before that, she had been a classroom teacher. So she was a high school math teacher, and then she was a K-12 art teacher, and then she moved to just elementary art.
Hello, everyone. This is Gretchen Rowe for the Demi Learning Show, and I am so wildly excited to welcome Dr. Mary Sagzawa today. This is a full circle journey for me because Mary is a professor of neuropsychology, and that was my emphasis when I was in college. And then I went off to have children and did not return to that. But I've also known Mary since she was, as the phrase goes, a twinkle in her daddy's eye. I've known her whole life. And it is so awesome to watch her in this guise now as a college professor. This is going to be a wild conversation today because I've known her mom for 40 years, and we are two peas in a pod. We only see each other once, maybe twice a year. But when we're together, we have that blessed kind of friendship that means we pick up the threads exactly where we laid them down when we saw each other last. Mary has joined me today because we want you to understand the world of psychology, particularly the world of neuropsychology, since it is the fastest growing field. And I just want her to talk about what she does because, man, I think you'll be as excited as I am. Mary, please introduce yourself.
As Gretchen mentioned, my name is Mary Saxawa. I am an assistant professor of psychology at Hanover College in Southern Indiana. So my area of expertise, I like to joke that I study why middle school messes you up for the rest of your life. I study puberty, popularity, and stress hormones and how all of that goes into development of psychological disorders. A lot of my research has been focused on anxiety and depression and aggressive behavior problems, things like that. But in recent years, based on my own personal experiences and experiences that I've seen with my students, a lot of my emphasis has shifted toward kind of hormonal and neurobiological correlates of neurodivergence. So, including autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, and things like that. And so, because of that, a lot of my teaching, I do social psychology, but most of my emphasis is on neuroscience, the biology of psychological disorders, development of psychological disorders, and as well as in recent years, I've also been teaching courses on behaviorism, which also fits in very well with the neurodivergence because it's a lot of, if you're familiar with ABA therapy, the good and the bad. I know there are a lot of controversial opinions, or there are a lot of differing opinions on ABA therapy, but these therapies kind of largely are based on this concept of behaviorism. And so I teach a behaviorism course as well.
What fascinates me, Mary, is we know so much more about the chemistry of learning than we did when I was in college back, as my kids say, when rocks were soft. And so it has become really wildly enlightening for me. I use a lot of neurobiology when I talk with homeschool families so that they understand how their kids learn and when the terminus is beyond which learning ceases. And I'm just excited to get the chance to talk to you today because I think we're all going to learn a whole bunch. Mary, can we start talking about why this particular kind of psychology became a fascination for you? There's thousands of branches of psychology to pursue. How did you end up here?
So actually, the very first time that I got interested in neuroscience and biological psychology is actually from a book. So my mom was a librarian for many years, and even before she was a librarian, even before she was professionally a librarian, she was a librarian was a major hobby of hers.
Well,
And
she's a
so,
bookaholic. So, and
oh
actually,
yeah,
we have a webinar with her about talking to a librarian about reading, so I'll even link that in our show notes. So,
and one of the books, and I actually have a copy of it in my office. Um, is this book called A Mango Shaped Space. It is by Wendy Mass, and it is about a teenage girl who has a condition called synesthesia. Synesthesia is often referred to as a mixture of or a melding of senses. So you can taste numbers or you can smell shapes. It is where we see some crossing of pathways in the sensory systems. And so I read this book and I was just fascinated by it. And so I got really into synesthesia and the idea of synesthesia and kind of the neuroscience behind it. And that was when I was in middle school. But I was going to be a veterinarian. That was my plan from 6 years old on. I had decided where I was going to go to vet school. I had decided where I was going to go to undergrad based on where I wanted to go to vet school because it was a little bit easier to get into their vet school if I went there for undergrad. Um, I was going to go to UT Knoxville. I really liked their small animal vet program. But then when I was in high school, my high school, I went to a small school in rural Alabama, and we didn't have a lot of extracurricular options, and I was kind of bored. Um, and so I decided that I wanted to take some classes at the community college. Now, I couldn't take most of the courses that I wanted to as kind of prerequisites for vet school. I couldn't take any biology, I couldn't take any chemistry because I was still in high school. I didn't have the prerequisites to be able to take those courses. And one of the courses that they had that I could take was intro psych. And my parents assured me this will count as a general education requirement at pretty much any school. So go ahead and take that. The credit will transfer, it'll count toward your general education requirement. And the very first day of class, the professor says, "Who in here is planning on majoring in psychology?" And about half the class raised their hand. And I'm sitting there all smug, like, "Not me, I'm going to be a veterinarian." 3 classes in, I was hooked. I this is me now. This is who I'm going to be. I was also taking biology in high school at the same time, and I basically said, "Why don't we both it? Let's do both together." At the time, neuroscience as an undergraduate major was pretty rare. Now they're much more common, but at the time, uh, Emory University and Washington University in St. Louis were two of the only neuroscience undergraduate programs in the country, and that is actually how I ended up picking my undergraduate college. I ended up at Emory University in Atlanta. It was the much closer one, but they had a neuroscience program, and that is how I ended up kind of doing this area of research. From there, while I was in undergrad, I started working in a lab studying schizophrenia, looking at neurobiological correlates of schizophrenia. In graduate school, my graduate program was my master's is in developmental psychology, but for my doctorate, I added behavioral neuroscience on top of that. So it's developmental psychology and behavioral neuroscience. In addition to design, research design, and statistics, I did a sub concentration in statistics. We like to joke a lot in psychology that research is me search. So we study what we're interested in, we study what we know. So I ended up, like I said, I study miserable middle school experiences because my middle school experiences not the best. Research is me search, and so I really just got interested in why people are the way that they are and how different kind of neurobiological factors can contribute to behavior. So that's how I ended up here. Was going to be a veterinarian, took a class because it was a general education requirement, which most students a lot of times will think of as like, oh, these are classes I don't want to have to take art history. And then they find their passion.
That is very, very true. Do you still work in a research lab? Do you still run research?
So I am at a small liberal arts college. Uh, so what that means is my emphasis is teaching. Most of the time when you're looking at big state institutions or what we call R1 or big research institutions like Emory, or things like Harvard or Purdue or big state schools, those are typically going to have much more of an emphasis on research. So the faculty members teaching maybe one course a semester, but most of their emphasis and most of what they're evaluated on is going to be their research and grant funding and things like that. at small liberal arts colleges, our primary emphasis is teaching. So I am teaching much smaller classes. I'm doing much more one-on-one learning. I'm able to tailor the classes to my students much more than I could when I was teaching 250 students online at University of Florida when I was in grad school. Now I have 12 students in a lab for my neuroscience course instead. So I do research as well, though. So a lot of my research, I have student research assistants who work with me. Um, I'm actually currently doing some research looking at the effects of different cosmetic products and treatments that we use on hair and how that contributes to our ability to measure hormone concentrations in hair. Kind of like you can measure drug use in hairs, we can do the same thing for hormones. But we don't know really what the effects of washing your hair with different kinds of shampoo, blow drying it, use curling irons, things like that, what all that has an effect. So I'm doing some of those studies right now along with a couple of students, and we're actually using my dog's hair. So my dog gets shaved pretty regularly, and whenever he gets shaved, I just kind of take the hair along with me. So we're not shaving him specifically for research, but he whenever he gets shaved, I keep some of that hair to do some tests on it.
So you're a little bit in the field of veterinary science. I also remember the story of you having to have research animals at your house on the weekend of your wedding because
Yes,
it was so cold. That was
yes,
a
the
brutally
pipes
cold
burst.
winter.
Yes, the pipes burst in the building, where so my behaviorism course, it includes a rat lab. So we train the rats to press levers and run mazes and whatever the students want to choose to teach them to do. So that some of them teach them to play soccer, some of them teach them to finger paint, some of them teach them to ride skateboards. So I have little tiny rat-sized skateboards in my lab, as well as
Maybe
little
I
tiny
need one
rat
of those
clothes.
for the 2 clowns that are here in my
Yeah.
office.
And so the it got really cold right before my wedding, and the pipes burst, and I couldn't leave the rats here. They didn't have heat, they didn't have water. So, and it was right after Christmas. So the day after Christmas on December 26th, I had to drive up to campus and take 17 or I think it was 16 rats or eight, no, it was 18 rats. Had to pile 18 rats into my car and drive them and set them up in my basement 3 days before my wedding. So that was fun.
So, flexibility is a sign of intelligence, right?
Yes. And I will tell you that being a college professor is a lot of fun, especially as someone who is neurodivergent. I love digging deep into tasks, into different subject areas, and sharing that information, just info dumping on people. That's my entire job. And I'll have a student who says, "Hey, I want to do a project on this thing," and I say, "Yay, we get to go down a rabbit hole together again." And so we get to have a lot of fun with it.
That's awesome. So, what has surprised you most about this career path? What did you not expect that has delighted you?
Honestly, never expected to enjoy teaching. I never expected to want to be a teacher. As I mentioned, my mom was a librarian. Before that, she had been a classroom teacher. So she was a high school math teacher, and then she was a K-12 art teacher, and then she moved to just elementary art, and then she became a librarian. So we like to joke that she still doesn't know what she wants to be when she grows up.
Which is
And
why we get along so
yes,
famously,
yeah.
but that's not what we're here to talk about today.
And so I had seen one of the things that she had struggled a lot with is a lot of the bureaucracy and the paperwork that went with being a public school teacher, and having to deal with the restrictions and not being able to follow those passions of giving of spread of sharing this information and things like that. She ended up having to do so much other stuff other than teaching, and so I kind of knew I don't want to be a teacher. That's not what I want to do. My graduate program required us to teach 1 semester. So we were required to be the instructor of record, so the primary instructor, not a TA or teaching assistant or anything like that. The primary, the main one in the classroom, delivering the lectures, all of that for 1 semester. And so I figured that I would go in, I would do my 1 semester of teaching, and then I'd just go back to researching and being a TA. And I got in there and I fell in love with it. Um, I was required to do my 1 semester. I did I did 3 semesters that year. So I did fall, winter, and summer. And then I continued on, and most graduate students at most typically teach 1 course, at most 2. I think I ended up teaching 4 different
Oh, yeah.
courses. Yeah, because I
Remember your
ended up
mom
doing intro developmental research methods and neuroscience.
I
Ended up teaching
remember
all
your
of those.
mom telling me that, and I was like, "How is she ever gonna get out of grad school if she
It took
has
me a
all
while.
of these things on her
My
plate?"
my advisor did kind of put her foot down at one point and say, "You have to stop teaching. You have to graduate." Yeah, and so I just fell in love with it, and I knew I kind of saw when being at University of Florida, being one of those big research institutions, that I didn't love I love doing research, but I didn't love the pressure of being at a
Mm,
big research institution. We have this phrase, publish or perish. This idea that if you were not publishing multiple articles a year, which each one of those is practically a
right.
full-time job. Each article probably takes 3 to 6 months of diligent work to do,
Wow.
to put out. And if you're not publishing multiple papers per year and bringing in hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars in grant funding, you're not going to get tenure. You're not going to be able to keep your job. And that's not what I wanted. And so I knew that the small liberal arts education design was what I wanted, where I could really kind of emphasize on teaching, focus on the students and engaging with them and learning about them so that I could tie things more to their interests and help them keep that information longer. Um, and then do some research on the side as well.
So you sort of flip the script, and instead of making research the emphasis, it is sort of the codicil to your, endeavors, which is kind of interesting, and when we were getting ready, you said something I didn't expect you to say, which is that, now you're collaborating to update a statistics manual, and what you said was, "I love statistics." And I never thought I'd hear somebody say that. Now, expecting that to perhaps come from a Sagzawa doesn't surprise me because you all are so math oriented, but, I could still probably get in touch with the hives I had in the 2 semesters of statistics I had to take for my degree. So, tell us a little bit about that. Why do you love teaching statistics?
Yeah, so like you said, I do come from a very math-oriented family. I mean, I remember one year, we were coming home from Christmas Eve service, and my older brother was teaching us how to count in hexadecimal. Like, that's what we were doing. So instead of base 10, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then jumping up to the next series, counting in hexadecimal, which is 16. Um, and counting and that was what we did after Christmas Eve service on the way home because we're a bunch of nerds. Um, yeah, as I mentioned, I love statistics now. I hated statistics as an undergrad. I double majored in neuroscience and psychology as an undergrad. And the psychology major required us to take statistics and research methods. The neuroscience major did not, which as a neuroscientist who does a lot of statistics, I think that is incorrect, but Emory will do
That
whatever it
that
wants.
seems
Uh,
that seems so odd.
yeah, the neuroscience program there was a lot more focused on small N designs, which means like small sample sizes. And so you don't do statistics with those
Right,
typically,
sure.
because you can't when you only have 5 people, it doesn't make much sense to talk about means and standard deviations. You need to look at individual values. But so my undergraduate psychology degree, I had to take statistics and I absolutely hated it. It was so bad that I didn't want to take the second half of the sequence and I dropped my psychology major because
Mhm.
I hated it. I was miserable. I never wanted to take statistics again. I knew that in grad school I would have to take some and I was dreading it. So I get into statistics in grad school and I discover I love it. I absolutely fell in love with it. And the reason was that in my undergraduate statistics course, we were focusing so much on the formulas and doing things by hand and calculating everything by hand. And there are different formulas for we talk about definitional formulas and computational formulas. So the definitional formula makes sense conceptually, but it's a lot harder to do because, for example, if you're talking about the average and the standard deviation, um, for the standard deviation, using the definitional formula, it makes much more sense when you go through each step, but you're having to square values, you're having to take the square root of a large value. It's harder to do by hand. Whereas the computational formula is much more straightforward in terms of the math that you have to do, but it doesn't make as much sense of what the value means. In my undergraduate course, we were having to calculate things by hand. We were having to do these really advanced statistics by hand and show our work the whole way through. And so we're using these
With one of
computation.
these things, a
Yes.
pencil, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
once I once got points taken off because I used Excel to calculate the average before
Lord.
I did the standard deviation. I was supposed to show my work for the average the whole way through, even though we had already passed the section on calculating the average. And I'm like, okay, I've proven that I can do this part. Now let me use the shortcuts. And I
But you
got points.
still had to do it the long way with,
Yep.
as my kids call it, the stubby pencil. So,
Yes. Yes.
wow.
When I got to graduate school, however, that was the emphasis was much more on using the tools that we have, using these computer programs where we can put the data in. And it's about rather than learning how to calculate the formulas, it's learning which statistics we use in which situation and how we interpret those, what it means. If we're doing, for instance, a regression, how do we use a B weight versus a standardized beta weight? What do they mean? Why are both of them useful in different ways? And I knew that when I was teaching statistics, that was what I wanted to do. So I've actually been working with this textbook author. He and I met through Zoom about this time last year, probably, to talk about it because I said, "Hey, this book is great, but it uses a different computer program than we do. Would you be willing to update it for this?" And he said, "I don't have time, but you can do it." And I said, "Cool, let's do it." Uh, so I am. I
Great,
he's
more work, right? You're not
yeah,
busy
yeah.
enough.
And so I'm taking the framework that he already has and just updating some of the screenshots and things like that for this other computer program. And one of the things that we talked about in that conversation was we both agreed that these computational formulas are dumb. That they were useful at one point, but now they actually cause more confusion because they're using mathematical shortcuts, but it actually makes it so that you lose the real concept of what it means,
Mhm.
what the standard deviation means, what a correlation means. And so I had my students do these steps in Excel. I have each step, I have my worksheet set up so that they have to do each individual step and see how that fits together, see what these outcome values actually mean, and how the individual data points are contributing to that outcome value. And that makes make a lot more sense down the road when they're
Sure,
applying this to
because
their
you've got
research.
them doing the quantitative calculations, but you also had them getting the conceptual understanding so that they
Exactly.
can see why they have to apply a certain calculation in a certain
Yep.
situation, which is kind of
Exactly.
brilliant. That's pretty
Mhm.
amazing. So what's
Yep.
your favorite course that you teach? Are you gonna tell me it's statistics?
Statistics right now is my favorite. I love teaching research methods, largely because that is where I get to be the most creative. For a long time, I did not consider myself to be a creative person, which is funny if you know me, because again, my mom was an art teacher, which actually that was probably part of the problem, being a because I was a perfectionist, and being a perfectionist and having your mom as your art teacher does not go well together. So I did
No,
not
it doesn't
really.
sound like it.
Yeah, yeah, and you know how stubborn I can be. So,
Mm. I wasn't
um,
gonna say anything about that, but
I like to joke that if they didn't want me to be a contrarian, they should not have sang "Mary, Mary, quite contrary to me" my entire life. Not my fault.
that is very
Um,
true.
so, but I realized when I was in college that my creativity comes out actually in the form of coming up with research questions. And so if you give me any object, I can come up with multiple research questions for it. And it was really kind of interesting seeing the first time I taught research methods that this is not a common thing for people to just be able to come up with ideas off the top of their head. And so that's really where a lot of my creativity comes out. And I'm able to use that and help students. They say, I want to understand more about this concept. I say, okay, we can go this direction, we can go this direction, we can go this direction, we can go this completely different related direction. Um, and so I have a lot of fun with that one. And then the other one that I really love, my neuroscience course, my neuropsychology course, which is better term biological psychology, but that's the whole thing. And because we get to it's really kind of introducing students to this concept of neuroscience and getting them to see the science behind psychology. Because a lot of times people think of psychology as being a soft science or a social science, and it does kind of blur those lines. In at my college here, we are part of the natural sciences division, and all of our upper level classes and many of our lower level classes as well actually have labs, just like you would get with biology or
Mm,
chemistry or things like that, because we understand the importance of this hands-on learning and gathering that information through application, and really being able to kind of solidify those concepts through repetitive practice and applying them to their everyday lives. So I really love that one. And then my learning class is fun just because we get to play with the rats a lot.
of course, I have rats because I, threw a challenge to Shelby, who's a little bit younger than you are, when she was 10, and she wanted a pet rat, and my thought was over my dead body, so I said, "Go read every book on pocket pets, write me a paper, and then we'll talk." 20 years later, I still have rats. She's a biological researcher who no longer works with rats, but at one point did. And, you just kind of don't know where you're going to end up, do you? So help me understand how your students come to you. Do they come to you and say, I'm gung ho, I want to major in psychology, or do they come to you kind of going, psychology seems sort of interesting, and then they catch your enthusiasm?
Bit of both. So most of the students that come to me saying, I want to do psychology, I would say most of them come in with some pre-existing experience or interest in psychology, whether that is because they heard a podcast that was interesting, or in a lot of cases, have some experience with people with psychological issues of some sort, whether that is they have ADHD, or a friend had depression, or I've had students with neurological deficits, or who had, oh, I had this brain injury when I was a kid, and I'm really interested now that I see I'm interested in learning more about how that made me the person that I am today. And so again, a lot of it becomes research is me search. And then I end up with a fair number of students, especially in my intro psych class, who come in because they are interested in another major. They had planned on another major, and they realized that psychology still applies to them. So one of the
Mm,
activities that I tend to do in my intro psych class the very first day is I have them so they most of them are first year students, but I usually have a few sophomores, juniors, seniors, and I have them introduce themselves to their neighbor and then talk in a small group of 4 or 5 students about what is your major or what are you planning on majoring in or what are you planning on doing after college? What do you, if you have some idea of that yet? Um, and see if you can come up with a way that psychology applies to you. And so it's really
Interesting.
interesting seeing them kind of teasing out, and a lot of students come in because this is a general education requirement. It seems
Sure.
they think it's going to be pretty easy. And so why not just take intro psych? And a lot of them end up with a kind of an appreciation. I get a lot of students, the pretty straightforward ones. I get students in education. Okay, yes, I understand how psychology is useful. Business students, yes, because marketing is just
Sure.
social psychology with a bigger budget.
Mm.
And we
Yes.
see a lot of things like that. But I also get I one of the most common ones where I have students saying, "No, I can't figure out how psychology is going to relate to me," are in math and physics. And I'm like, okay, let's talk about dyscalculia. Let's talk about how we conceptually understand math,
Mhm.
and how we learn math, how we understand it. We're going to talk a lot about psychophysics, so the actual physics of sensation and perception. We're going to talk about we I had to learn electrical physics for neurobiology to understand how neurons work and how kind of the electrical signals are passed. And so I like to kind of show them different ways that these things are going to apply to them, even if your major has nothing to do with psychology, this course is still going to be useful. And so I
Sure.
end up with a fair number of students who are double majoring because they've seen, oh, I'm planning on majoring in business. It would probably be really helpful for me to understand the way people work well,
Right.
and things like
Can
that.
so help me understand, as a neuropsychologist, for our audience members who maybe don't understand the differences between a general psychology major and a developmental psychology. That was what my degree is in, and that in $5 will get me a cheap cup of coffee at Starbucks. So, help our audience understand some of the differences.
Basically, if you can think of some other area, there is a way that you can tie psychology to it. Some of the major kind of areas, kind of breakdown areas, are going to be developmental psychology, which my developmental program was a lifespan development. So we were looking across the lifespan.
Cross.
We're
Mhm.
looking at physical development, we're looking at cognitive development, we're looking at social development. So we're looking at all of these different pieces, including how people change in adulthood. So I'm actually getting ready to start a study with a student now, looking at how um, during perimenopause, how estrogen levels changing during perimenopause can affect the way that ADHD medications work,
Hmm,
and how well those
interesting.
medications work during based on hormone levels, and how those hormone levels change during perimenopause, and menopause. And so kind of developmental is going to be looking at changes and stability across the lifespan. So that's kind of developmental. We can look at social psychology, which is basically our interactions with other people, how we influence others, how others influence us, including how others influence us even when no one else is around. Have you ever tried to stand in an elevator facing the back wall with your back to the doors? It's very uncomfortable. And this is social psychology. Um,
Yes.
Cognitive psychology is kind of the area of understanding the way that we think. So, attention and decision making and memory and things like that. That's a lot of those kind of internal processes that are going on. Uh, Related to that is going to be biological psychology. And biological psychology, sometimes referred to as psychobiology or neuropsychology or behavioral neuroscience, has a lot of different names. Is really looking at the the brain. We look at brain chemistry. We look at brain anatomy. We look at connections between different parts of the brain. And we also look at how medications change things. We look at genetics and how genetics influence these different processes in the brain. In fact, you might be able to see, I have a giant slinky back here. I use that giant slinky to teach genetics when I teach about the genetics of psychology. Um, if there's a whole thing on for epigenetics. Um, and then we can look at clinical psychology, which is probably clinical or counseling psychology. This is the area that most people are probably most familiar with. This is looking at disorders and treatments and things like that. We can look at personality psychology, which is kind of social psychology, abnormal psychology, looking at personality, what contributes to our personality. Um, Behaviorism oftentimes falls under the umbrella of neuroscience or cognitive psychology. Kind of ironic that it gets lumped in with cognitive psychology because the majorly the really intense the original behaviorists absolutely hated cognitive psychology and said that it wasn't scientific because we couldn't measure it. um, B.F. Skinner did not
I
like
was gonna
cognitive
s
psychology.
I was about to say, "Oh, so now
Yep,
we're talking about Skinnerian psychology," because
yep.
he was really opposed to that, but
Yep. John Watson, B.F. Rosalie Rayner,
Mm.
B.F. Skinner, they did not like cognitive psychology. But a lot of times behaviorism gets lumped in there with that.
But isn't it
This also,
also true that we
mhm.
have so much more insight into, behavioral psychology now than
Oh
Skinner,
yeah.
Watson,
And
and
that's
all of them
because
had?
I mean, as you've probably picked up on, a lot of these areas are intertwined. And modern behaviorism accepts that we have to measure some cognition. We have to, there are mental processes that we are missing a major piece of the picture if we ignore everything and only measure what we can see from the outside. So modern behaviorism is largely cognitive. There's a lot of overlap there. Um, but yeah, you've probably noticed that there's a lot of overlap with a lot of these areas. So I talk about neuroscience as being kind of the chemistry of the brain and how that
Sure.
affects behavior. But I was also talking about neuroscience in terms of developmental psychology and how the brain changes across development. We can look at how brain changes. We have the whole area of social neuroscience. So the way that the brain contributes to social interactions, and how changes in the brain can lead to differences in social interactions. A lot of what I do is kind of biological psychopathology. So, understanding the biology, the neuroscience behind psychological disorders. And then that leaves out an entire area that I haven't mentioned yet, which is industrial and organizational psychology or
Mhm.
business psychology. This is HR management, but it's also so a lot of people in IO or business psychology are in HR and human resources, but a lot of it is really based on how do we get people to be motivated? How do you make good leaders? How do you communicate effectively? And how do you make people the most effective and happiest people they can be because that's how you're going to be
Sure.
get good workers. It's kind of like
Sure.
the good cheese comes from happy cows. Good work,
Yes.
good product comes from happy employees.
Well,
And that
we
is
have
industrial and
even
organizational.
in when we construct our booths at conferences, the way we place tables is based on the industrial psychology of being welcoming to invite people into your booth to have a conversation with you. So, yeah, and things that people would not normally think have anything to do with it really have a lot to do with it
hmm
because
I actually have a friend who has a master's degree in human computer interaction. It is a human factors psychology is a whole other is an area of psychology that falls under sometimes industrial organizational, sometimes under biological and cognitive. We used to have a human factor psychologist here who helped develop the cockpits in airplanes to make them more user friendly for pilots.
hmm,
What color an LED is on the dashboard is going to affect based on how well your eyes see different kinds of colors. So this is why in cockpits, they're not going to have any bright blue LEDs because bright blue light is going to mess with, it's going to make your pupils constrict.
Sure. Sure.
So if it is dark out, if a pilot is flying out at night, you don't want them looking at a bright blue LED and their pupils constricting and then they can't see. But
Right. You
if
don't need
you
them squinting in the cockpit.
exactly. And this is why those really bright blue LED headlights are such a pain if you're driving at night. Because your pupils
Yes.
constrict and then you can't
Sure.
see as soon as the car passes you. And
Sure.
so there are a lot of areas. So my friend with a master's in human computer interaction, she helps design apps and websites in order to make them more user friendly. She helps with font choices and color choices and where menus should go and things like that in order to kind of increase the usability of websites and apps.
And the engagement therein,
Mhm.
because if you can get
Yep.
somebody to stay, then they're going to interact more positively. So, Mary,
Yep.
tell me, how does your chosen field give you insight as a neurodiverse person, give you insight into Mary as a neurodiverse person?
So it has really helped a lot for me, and I will also totally out my kids right now. I have three step kids, and two of them have ADHD diagnoses, and it has actually been very helpful to be able to have the language to explain this is what's happening, both for myself and for them. So we could say like, okay, you are having a really hard time right now. You were doing really well all day. You're having a really hard time because your Adderall wore off. Your
Sure.
dopamine wore off. You don't have dopamine, so you're seeking it out. You are trying to find a way to feel better, and you're having a hard time because of that. In with a lot of people, this is not for everyone. Helping to label those things makes life much easier. Because then I know for me, I got my ADHD diagnosis when I was 34. I already had my doctorate. This I had worked at colleges full time. I was at my third full time teaching position, and when I got my diagnosis of ADHD. So I had already done my dissertation and everything.
I was
Just white,
55,
yeah,
so
just white knuckled my way through the whole all of graduate school. And so it's really helpful for me to understand what's going on. As I mentioned, the research on perimenopause and ADHD symptoms comes from my own experience and talking to friends and to colleagues about our symptoms and kind of then I was able to go digging of why would it be certain times we're seeing these waves, these ups and downs and then because I understand about the different chemistry involved and the hormones involved, I can see, oh, dopamine requires estrogen to work. When my estrogen levels are
right.
low, even the medication's not going to work very well because it can't actually work in the brain without that
Well, and
estrogen.
that's interesting you should say that. I had got my perimenopause diagnosis and my ADHD diagnosis the same year. Mary, what would your closing words be?
I would say kind of closing advice is just try to keep things fun and keep things novel and keep in mind that you are always learning and that learning is a lifelong process and you can learn as much from others as they can learn from you and to keep that fun and to try and keep that creativity and that drive for information going.
Wonderful. Mary, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I'm going to conclude the webinar now, but I have to tell you, this surpassed my expectations beyond the pale. So, of course, I knew it would, but it's been so much fun to spend the last hour with you. Thank you so much for your time. It's been
Thank you so much
amazing.
for having me.
All right, take
Thanks.
care. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thanks again for joining us. We're glad to be a part of your educational community. You can help us grow our community even more by rating, reviewing, and subscribing to the show wherever you may be hearing this. Don't forget that you can access the show notes and watch a recording at demilearning.com/show or on our YouTube channel. We'll see you again next time. Until then, keep building strong foundations for lifelong learning.